We here at Totally Motors like to get naked every now and then. And no, I'm not talking about what's lurking below the camera's eye line. We haven't started an OnlyFans just yet. We're still talking bikes. And recently, we've been riding the new Ducati Street Fighter V2 and the BMW S1000R. But what about some Japanese offerings to the market? Well, Honda are yet to release their new post-Euro 5 version of the Hornet, Kawasaki are putting a lot more focus on their new 400 range, and Suzuki, well, we don't really know what the future holds for Suzuki. So that just leaves Yamaha, and we jumped on the MT-09 to see how that stacks up. And the simple answer is not very well. And this is a real shame because I'd already had a big disappointment with the Tri-City 300 and couldn't understand what on earth Yamaha was thinking with it, as it seemed to get just about everything wrong. So I was thoroughly looking forward to jumping on something a bit more powerful and coming back with a big grin on my face and then wondering what the hell to say about it, in a similar vein to the Ducati Street Fighter. Not on this occasion though, as I have plenty to say about this. The first thing to get out of the way is that this bike just feels cheap. Every little control on the handlebars is fiddly and hard to use with gloves on. And while the screen for the dashboard is, on first impressions, fine, it's obviously not going to stack up to Ducati's dash and what I would say is now the market benchmark with BMW. It still seems to be an improvement over the old LCD screens. But then after a while, you actually start to miss the older LCD style screens because they were so much more simple and clearer. The MT-09's dashboard is way too busy and also very shiny, which makes it far harder to read than it should be. You should be able to just glance at the dash and get the information that you need, not look down and try and figure out where the hell the information you need is, or to wait for the sun to move off it. It's not exactly ideal when the answer to the question, "Sir, do you know how fast you were going?" is, "No, but I do like how these sunglasses look." Now, it's not all bad, of course. In some areas, the MT-09 is actually very practical. For one thing, it is fantastically comfy. It has a beautifully plush seat, and the shape of the tank fits wonderfully around the rider's legs. And also, this is one of the only naked bikes on the market where the mirrors actually work. Most of the time with other bikes in this category, you'll be lucky to get a good view of your own elbows, whereas with this, you can actually see what's behind you. Now that might not sound like much of a big deal, but for me is a big tick. Despite the bike not being particularly tall, it does actually feel like you're sat quite high up in the seat and that your field of view is opened up, more so than with some of the competition, where your bottom half is still quite tucked in a sports bike-like position. And add to that it is plenty fast enough. I was actually quite surprised how quick it felt. The 900cc triple pulls away much better than you think it will when you first jump on. Unfortunately, none of this really makes up for its shortcomings. The brakes and suspension, for example, feel, well, there's no other word for it than weird. At times I'd feel like the suspension was smashing into every little bump in the road, and at other times it felt so floaty that I was bobbing up and down like an amateur porn star. I won't do that move again. Couple that with the fact that the brakes felt confidence-inspiring one minute and woefully inferior the next. I had very little confidence when riding this thing, which isn't great when we've already established that it's pretty quick. Now, obviously we didn't have too much time to start delving into the different suspension settings and to try and see if we could alleviate some of those issues, which we may well have been able to do with more time. But the big thing was that it's not that the brakes and suspension just didn't feel good and that they needed some work, it's that they felt completely inconsistent despite no adjustments being made on them. And honestly, I don't even know how that's possible. When we gave the bike back to Yamaha, there was a lot of chin scratching and biting of tongues until they eventually described the brakes and suspension as adequate for the bike. So when Yamaha themselves can't even make it seem like they've been engineered particularly well, it makes me a bit more confident that it's not just me that feels like they're cheap. Our chief mechanic Bertie described it as the new XJ6, in that it's a pretty basic bike, but one that'll probably go forever. And I have to agree with him. Fast forward a few years and this would probably make a good budget-conscious second-hand buy that'll deliver decent speed and comfort. But I cannot see any reason why you'd want to buy this thing brand new. It is considerably cheaper than some of the more premium options like the Ducati and the BMW, but it's still not cheap. £10,000 is still a lot of money to disappear from anyone's bank account. And while there is an SP version of this bike, which is, I'm sure, a nicer experience, it demands a price tag that is just too high for a bike that feels budget. And while it might seem like a relatively minor gripe, good God, this thing is ugly. It looks like someone watched a Michael Bay Transformers movie and suddenly had an epiphany. And I have to admit, I'm struggling to understand who this bike is for in the first place, because there is also an MT-10, which is essentially the naked version of the R1, which would make sense to have in your range, except for the fact that it's less comfortable and less competitively priced than the MT-09. And then below that, there is also an MT-07, which, with the introduction of the R7, also makes sense to have in your range, and has actually sold very well too. So you have a 700cc twin-engine sports bike and a naked bike to go along with it, and then you have a 1000cc four-cylinder sports bike and naked bike to go along with it. So how does it make good business sense to slap a 900cc triple in the middle of it all? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not angry that they did, but then Yamaha is only competing with itself, because this feels like it's the better deal than the MT-10, even though the MT-10 would deliver more sports bike performance, even though also it's not going to be as good as the BMW. But what it all comes down to is, I was happy to give the MT-09 back and won't be going back to it anytime soon. But until we find a Yamaha that we actually like, I'll see you next time.